everyone, and my pleasure to be here. Let's get right to business and the introduction of our esteemed panel, and I'll also then tell you a little bit about the format of how our questions and answers will work today. We have been seated in alphabetical order: former Congressman Ed Case, Lieutenant Governor Doug Chin, State Representative Beth Fukumoto, State Representative Kanyala Ainu, State Senator Donna Mercado Kim, and Honolulu Council Chair Ernie Martin. Our question and answer round will be broken up into 4 different rounds. There will be a 30-second question asking period. That's from myself and from our 2 esteemed panelists there. There will be 60 seconds to respond, followed by the next question. Our timekeeper is there in the middle. Watch for cues. As you get close, you'll see some signs come up as far as as you're getting close to the end of the 10-second mark. And you know you're getting close. You will be able to finish your thought, but please, in the interest of time, especially with 6 panelists, go ahead and wrap it up when you get to the red mark. Rounds 1 will be from the 3 of us. Round 2, you'll actually get to ask a question of each other. And this was drawn in a certain order that is in the reverse of the opening statements. I'll remind each of you who gets to ask that question first. Choose one of your opponents to ask a question to. Ask your question in 30 seconds. The recipient answer it in 60, and the asker can rebut in 30 seconds if you choose. So that one's going to be a little tricky. Then in rounds 3 and 4, we'll be back to asking questions from myself and our panelists. And at the end, I'll close with a question from the audience. So do be thinking of some questions, and if you come up with something, please jot it down. I think there were some pieces of paper you grabbed on the way in, and those will be brought to me, and we'll choose from one of those to close our program with. I'll begin with the first question, and this one will begin in alphabetical order, and then we'll rotate through. So Mr. Case, you'll have this first question. Be the first to answer this question. As international trade wars escalate, and with crackdowns on immigration reducing both illegal but also legal immigration and trade, what will you do in Congress to keep open the vital trade, work, and education visa programs that are so important to our Hawaii visitor industry?
Thank you so much, and first of all, thank you to everybody, Mufi and Rick and everybody for organizing this. I want to introduce my incredible wife, Audrey, over here, and photographer at the moment, and of course my outrigger, Ohana, who are in the room. Thank you so much for coming. I think I gave them a good excuse to back out of work for a little while. You know, when I was in Congress the first time around, tourism was one of my top priorities, and I think it has to be the top priority for anybody from Hawaii. And you have to focus across the board at all of the elements that drive tourism. You have to keep airlift open, for example. You have to avoid trade wars in the airlines. You have to be sure people can come here. You have to be sure they can crack through immigration and get visas or get visa-free travel. And that was really the area that I felt we had the most benefit from in terms of keeping visitors visiting here is visa-waived travel from, especially from the Asian Pacific countries. We haven't finished that business yet. We need to finish it.
Thank you. Mr. Chin.
Hello everyone, I'm Doug Chin. Thank you very much for being here. Obviously, immigration and our trade wars that are going on right now in the country, it's a very serious issue, and it's something that, to my mind, is something that unless we are addressing that in Washington, D.C., it could potentially affect an entire generation. And that is because the decisions that are made now on who gets to enter the U.S., who doesn't get to enter, how the U.S. does business with people, that really impacts what the United States is going to be like for the next 20 or 30 years. And so I feel very committed to the education visa program. As the Attorney General, when I was arguing the travel ban lawsuit all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, one of the arguments that we made was just how important it was to have diversity and inclusiveness for our university system, and to make sure that we really protected that. So I would support the education visa system, and you can count on me for that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. My name is Beth Fukumoto. I currently represent the District of Mililani and Milani Malka in the state legislature. I think on the issue of immigration, the first thing that we need to start talking about, just in general, we can talk about work visas and education visas, and we do need to protect those programs. But I think the broader problem is the failure of both parties to come up with real reform and to be willing to pass things, even if it's incrementally. We do need full reform, but we also need some as one of the legislative leaders, I was able to work with other legislative leaders in other states, and one of the things I always heard is that the businesses, even on the border states, desperately wanted immigration policy because it helps them. Bringing new people into this country helps our economy. It doesn't hurt, and we need to start treating them like they belong. Thank you.
Mr. A.
Aloha, my name is Kaniela Ng. I'm currently the majority policy leader in the State House, where we set issues of statewide priorities. And the issue of immigration is a really important one. We all come from that plantation background here in Hawaii. I know myself, I'm over 6 different races. And you know, it was that diversity that brought us to where we are. So I support not just protecting DACA, but passing a Clean Dream Act, also abolishing the American Gestapo, known as ICE, who's committing horrendous human rights abuses across the nation, not just at the border, but right here in Hawaii. Opening up the trade, not pushing tariffs on countries, because we know that actually isolates folks and makes them more dangerous and threatens our national security. So yes, our focus should be on tourism, but not exclusively. We need to make sure that we look at our economy holistically in ways that are sustainable in the long run.
Aloha everyone, it's so good to be here. When I was in the legislature, I chaired the tourism committee, and that's because tourism is so important to our state. International trade is so important to our economy, and that is something that we need to really focus in on. And immigration policy needs to be looked at again, because we have to go back to the basics. We have to make sure that these policies that we're looking at is doing what we intended for it to do. As far as our visa waiver, that is something that I've worked on personally. I've worked on the Korean visa waiver policy and the China waiver policy. And these countries really put burdens on, our country puts burdens on these visitors that come here. And that is one thing that I consistently want to work on. We also need to look at how we welcome these visitors when they do come into our country. When we look at customs and we look at the security, that they have to stand in line for hours and hours sometimes. And so that's another area that I think we have to look at our custom laws and make sure that we enforce all of our policies. Thank you.
Mr. Mark.
Aloha, my kako. Aloha. You know where I stole that line from? Mayor Mufi Hanneman. Because I was part of his cabinet, and I spoke on his behalf many a time, so I've heard him speak. But I wanted to thank Mayor Hanneman for inviting me here today. You know, I'm fortunate. I served as part of his cabinet. I served on the city council, which the mayor preceded me. Although I served longer than him as the chairman, I'm not going to say how long he served. But with regards to the question that was asked, of course, you know, all of these visa programs, immigration visa programs, and visa waiver, allowances for education, and even work visas are very critical. I think very important to our state. But I think one of the dangerous pathways that the present administration is focusing on is engaging in these trade wars, which to me is very detrimental to our state, that we've got to keep a critical eye on whoever gets to represent Hawaii in Congress. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question will be from Allison Schaefer's Waikiki Bureau Chief, the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
Last year, President Trump included Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument in his review of national monuments and their boundaries. There was an immediate pushback from scientists and cultural protectors, but the scope of this monument has been controversial. Some members of Hawaii's fishing and visitor industries oppose President Obama's decision to expand it. President Trump has backed off from altering this monument for now. However, if he brought the topic back up, where would you stand? So the first answer would go to Lieutenant Governor Chin.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Allison. Right after the Papahanaumokuakea monument was placed on the list by the Secretary of Interior, as the Attorney General, I was able to meet with Earth Justice and talk to them about what are we going to do to make sure that we fight back and preserve the monument that was put in place first by President Bush, but then expanded under President Obama. And I think there are great reasons for that that are completely consistent with Hawaii values, and that is protecting our ocean, really making sure that we are doing everything that we can to protect the species that are there. They are actually absolutely critical to our environment. And as it turns out, it hasn't turned out to be placed on the list. But I want you to know that as long as I was Attorney General, that it was something that was very important that we fight back against. So yes, I support the expansion.
Thank you.
Ms. Fukumoto.
Yes, I have a very similar answer. I have supported the monument. I've supported the expansion of the monument. More than that, I do not believe that we should be closing any of our national monuments or national parks. I think that we need to protect them. They're a long legacy for our country, and it's important to keep them there for future generations. More than that, I also think that we overall need to have a better plan for our fisheries. Making sure I do understand the concerns of all the fishermen that have come out against this monument, and they just want to find a place to fish. This is not the place to do that, but I think one of the things that we can do on a state level is at least work more with DLNR. Maybe the federal government can help them with better enforcement so that we can be sure that our local residents are not being banned from fishing in these areas, but we have foreigners coming in and fishing those areas too. So definitely one of the components is enforcement, making sure we're funding that, and making sure that we do have respect for the men and women who are fishing and have done that for such a long time here in Hawaii.
Thank you. When the expansion of Papahanaumokuakea was first proposed by Obama, there were most members of the legislature, even within the Democratic Party, opposed the expansion, and they signed on to a resolution that was championed by the Longline Fishing Lobby. As a chair of Ocean Marine Resources and Hawaiian Affairs, I helped champion the expansion and make sure that we organize a movement of environmentalists across the nation to make sure that we're not just protecting these areas for ecological reasons, but for economic as well. There will be no tuna in the ocean by the year 2040 under the current take levels. So even for the interest of the fishermen and to allow their kids to fish, we need to support these sorts of expansions and also protect national monuments and sanctuaries across the nation.
You know, this monument and these kinds of protections are so important to our environment, to our ocean. We are in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But at the same time, I think it's important that when these decisions are made, that the local people, that the people of the state is also considered in part of the conversation. And I think that was part of the problem when the expansion took place, was that they were never part of this whole discussion as to how it's going to affect our islands, how it's going to affect the lifestyle, the livelihoods of the fishermen here that rely upon that as part of our everyday living here. Having said that, though, we need to balance. We need to balance how we protect our oceans, how we protect our resources, but at the same time, we also need to make sure that we are part of that conversation and that we are going to make sure that our young people and the future of Hawaii is dependent as to this continued collaboration that we continue to have on this issue. Thank you.
Mr. Martin.
I wouldn't get rid of my two, but anyway, you know, I think when the expansion was proposed, it was very controversial. On both sides of the issues, very strong arguments for, very strong arguments against. You know, I think once that decision was made, then the decision was made. You know, I understand the arguments from those who are seeking to reverse that decision, but perhaps the best decision is to leave it as is and adjust. I mean, Kaniawa is right. You know, in any decision that is made, especially a political decision, there's certain consequences to that particular action. The easiest, I guess, remedy would be to go back on a decision and question the validity of the decision itself. But my preference has always been that once a decision is made, you move forward and you adjust and accommodate. Thank you. I'm not going to give the mic to Donna.
Of all of the actions I took in my prior service in Congress, the one I'm most proud of is the creation of Papahanao Mokuakea. I introduced a bill in Congress that proposed it be the largest marine reserve in the world. I worked with the Bush administration to convince President Bush that it would be good for his record, including his environmental record in particular, that he was the person who created it. So that shows that you can work across the aisle to get something done. I did that over a lot of opposition. I think it was the right thing to do. I think that there should be some places in the world where you don't compromise at all, where you keep them pristine. When you think that the Hawaiian monk seals in this world are down to what, 1,300 now, and that's where they have a refuge, that's where they're going to make their stand, then you decide to protect it. So I agree with Kaneola Ing, actually. I applaud him for the work he did to expand it further and to resist the contraction.
Thank you. Our next question will be from Ashley Nagaoka, reporter with Hawaii News Now.
Thank you, Gina. So what or who do you believe is the current greatest threat to the United States? And what can we do at the federal level to defend ourselves, especially here at home? Representative Fukumoto, you can go first.
I think that the Russian government and Putin have shown to be the greatest threat to the United States right now. It's easy to get distracted by some of the other issues. I would include that definitely terrorism is a huge issue, but more than anything else, my biggest concern is that we're not treating Russia like the threat that it is. That's the concern. That's why Russia is the biggest threat. That we can be experiencing hacking and interference in our elections and have a president that's unwilling to do anything about it is incredibly dangerous for American democracy. So I would say that it's Russia, although there are many other threats that are facing us right now.
I starkly disagree with that one. Russia is not the biggest threat to America, let alone Hawaii. The idea that the Russian government would actually attack America is preposterous. It's unstrategic and naive. Realistically, the real threat that we're facing right now is oligarchical control of our government by just a few corporations. And that's more than a who, it's a what. Climate change could put Waikiki underwater within my son's lifetime, a 3-foot sea level rise, unless we act now. Hawaii will become the climate refugee capital of the Pacific, which means we'll be strapped for resources. That will cause stability all across Asia, and that's where the real national security concerns will come from. And the only way we can really fight that is to stand up to corporate polluters and big oil who are buying out our politicians and take bold climate action now through a Green New Deal.
I think our greatest threat is us. Our people, our gun violence that is going on throughout our country. And that is something that we need to be able to have a better handle on, to be able to control. I know here in Hawaii, we have the strictest gun control laws, but on the federal level and across the country, when we see the violence that go on, and we see the children in our schools that are gunned down, I think that is the greatest threat to us. And it's not only gun violence, I think it's domestic violence and its abuse and the erosion of our equal rights and treating everybody with respect and dignity. Mr. Martin.
Thank you. I think from a political perspective, President Trump is the biggest threat to America. I mean, every day he makes more and more outlandish statements. You know, so that's something that we all have to be concerned about. You know, from a military perspective, I come from a military background. My family served in the military, and I'm fortunate in my position on the council to get very detailed briefings on our military, from a military perspective. Definitely, China, Russia, and Korea will always remain the biggest threats to the United States, and especially to Hawaii. But believe me, the war on terrorism is not over. It's a different breed of terrorists nowadays. They don't need a gun. You see all the terrorist attacks happening across the world, especially in Europe. They're not using weapons. The weapons they are using are common, everyday, tools that anybody can get access to. They just rent a vehicle, drive up a sidewalk, take out 20 people, no problem. And you never know where it's coming from, because the way these guys are being radicalized is far different than just 5 and 10 years ago. Thank you.
Mr. Case.
When you're a member of Congress, you are of course responsible to assist your state in Washington, D.C., but you also have an obligation and responsibility of national leadership. You are a national leader. And that obligation requires you to rise above the events of the day and think long term, and then identify the threats and opportunities and work backwards to today to figure out what we can do today. So in that context, I agree very much with the statements that Russia is an incredible threat today and will continue to be, and that terrorism is an incredible threat. But the biggest threat and opportunity is our relationship with China over the next decades. That can go very wrong, or that can go very right. If it goes very wrong, it's going to be a very bad situation, including, by the way, for Hawaii tourism. So we need to make that one right.
Mr. Chin.
I literally felt like every single person stole my answer, because I just want to say all of the above on these things. So I'll throw out one more person that I think is a big threat to the United States. And it's a man named Brett Kavanaugh. He is President Trump's nominee to be on the United States Supreme Court. And with that nomination, there's going to be a very different conservative majority that really hasn't existed for as long as we know, and it really threatens so many of the values that have been important to Hawaii, whether it's been women's rights, certainly the Roe versus Wade and that potentially being overturned, labor unions, other things that have to do with the environment, and of course, our civil rights. And so, to me, that is why being in Congress, a member of Congress, is even more important, because if we aren't going to have a check and balance that's coming from the United States Supreme Court, then we darn well better have that coming from Congress. And that's why I want to serve in Congress, is to be able to be that check upon the president and protect Hawaii's values.
Thank you. This next round of questioning will be the ones where you get to ask each other a question, respond, and the asker gets to rebut. I'll tell you the order that is the reverse of what was drawn, but I'll also remind you through it, because this is the one that gets really complicated with so many people. First will be Mr. Martin asking, then Mr. Ng, then Mr. Case, Ms. Kim, Ms. Fukumoto, and Mr. Chin. And the science behind that is, again, the reverse of what they drew at random for their closing statements. And I'll also give you those orders again. So Mr. Martin, choose your opponent to question.
Okay, I'm going to ask Beth Fukumoto a question, only because people think that we colluded on the Hawaii News Now debate, and she threw me a softball question that was too easy for me to answer. So I'm going to ask her an easy question. Not related to any of the debates, but something that I think you all should hear. Because I think all of the candidates are well qualified, but sometimes we don't do a good job of talking about our accomplishments. So Beth, being in the legislature over the years, what would you consider your most significant accomplishment as a legislator, and why?
Thank you, that is a nice question. I think the most significant accomplishment for me was being able to get Mililani Middle School on the track for being a single track system. When my sister when they first built Mililani Middle School, our kids had to be on a track system. That meant that once we put in extra school days, our kids in Mililani were missing 30 days of school compared to their peers every year. The thing that we needed to do to fix that was just build one more building. This has been a problem going on for 14 years, and nobody realized we just needed another building. We were able to get that other building, and now the kids in Mililani are going to be able to go to school on one track, have the same summer as their peers, and also get the same amount of school days. So for me, that was definitely the biggest thing that we did.
You have time for a rebuttal if you wish.
Just a short rebuttal, but I'm very familiar with that project. Beth knows that I also represent Mililani Mauka as well. It's very difficult being a parent myself, 3 kids in school. To have a dual track or multi-track program is very burdensome on the parent. But what Beth failed to mention, and this was a really county-state initiative, because in order to build that additional classroom, they have to build on the county's land. And we provided the access, the memorandum of understanding, to relieve Castle and Cook of their obligation of restricting the use of the park so that the additional classroom could be built. So it's a true win-win for everyone. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you. Mr. Ng, you can ask the next question.
Okay, thank you. This question is for Mr. Chin.
That's why I'm holding the microphone.
So I appreciate your recent stances to end private prisons and for criminal justice reform, but your whole career was on the other side as a prosecutor and then a lobbyist for a private prison just a few years ago before you became AG. How can we trust you to be the progressive voice you now say you are when you've got paid more money from private prison than in just a few months than most of us make in a year?
So what I'll say is this, is that part of being a prosecutor was that I was able to see how criminal justice reform has actually changed over the years. In fact, I think probably out of everybody on this stage, I'm better equipped to really be able to talk about how much what law enforcement has done to be able to fix the system and to be able to address overcrowding in prison and the disparity that exists in sentencings. I'm in a really good position to be able to see what has happened there. So some of the things that have happened that have really helped out is we've been able to move away from mandatory minimum prison sentences and move to a more rehabilitative model, one that really is able to help people to find themselves in a better place that addresses the underlying causes of what happens in their crimes. With respect to private prisons, I absolutely believe that people from who are out of state need to come back to the mainland. My time lobbying for the prison system that was, the private prison that was had a contract with the state was one where the contract was never up for renewal, and it was also a time when the discussion that was happening in the state was all about how to bring inmates back and to be able to build more prisons. So thank you.
Mr. Ingram.
Prisons here.
The love of my life, Cara, and I met when there was a resolution that was being proposed. I was vice chair of public safety at the time, and I was the only legislator on my side of the table that was in opposition of this new private prison. I guess in order to bring folks home, there's a new, and she was the only one on her side of the table that was against it. So we instantly fell in love. And our matchmaker was Mr. Doug Chin. It was his resolution trying to bring a new private prison. So it's great that everyone's against private prisons and for criminal justice reform now. But I've been doing that since day one, and I'm glad to see everybody jump on the bandwagon, and I'm happy to keep driving it.
Mr. Case, your questions.
Donna, we had so much fun at that last debate. I figured I'd continue the discussion. You have represented to the industry, the tourism industry, Hawaii's largest industry, encompassing 200,000 plus odd jobs, that you are a supporter of the industry. And yet in the last year, you voted to increase the transient accommodations tax, voted to dramatically expand the transient accommodations tax, and failed to lead on the #1 issue for this industry, which is illegal vacation rentals, which are wrecking the hotel industry and wrecking neighborhoods and driving home prices up. How do you respond to that inconsistency?
Well, I don't believe there's inconsistency there. I think you have to balance everything. I certainly voted reluctantly to expand the TAT for the rail because I really felt that we should have taken it out of the GET. Also, as far as the illegal transient vacation units, I have been on the forefront as opposing that. In fact, I have worked with the HTA in coming up with a study on trying to identify the TAT, the illegal rentals, and worked with the bill that actually required people to put their license number on all of their advertisements. And so I've been after the tax department to follow up and to enforce this law to make sure that we are able to take off illegal rentals. As far as the bill itself, or the B&B bill, I've been very vocal against that, and I will continue to support the industry in so many ways. I've started in 2001 as the tourism chair, and I had the opportunity to revamp the whole tourism authority.
Well, in terms of the TAT increase, of course, there was an alternative, and some of your colleagues did vote for that alternative and did vote against raising the TAT, which was our industry's #1 concern. And in all honesty, participating in that legislative hearing left an incredible distaste in many of them. Now, I'm not going to pin that whole thing on you, but the legislature was really not happening on that. In terms of illegal vacation rentals, you got to make the decision, introduce the bills, and it's time to finish studying already. The rest of the country New York yesterday just passed a very strong illegal vacation rental bill. We're dragging behind because Airbnb and its lobbyists are contributing to a lot of these campaigns and are not allowing the reforms needed to be pursued.
Ms. Kim, your question.
Okay, well, I guess one good turn deserves another, Mr. Case. Well, you gave up your seat in Congress to run against Senator Akaka for the Senate, and then you also ran against Mazie Hirono for the Senate in 2010. I think that was the right year. And now you want to go back to the House. So will you commit, as I have, that if you are elected, that you won't use the seat as a springboard to run for the Senate again?
Yeah, no, I'll give you a really direct answer. I'm not going to make those kind of pledges because, it's really, really easy to make that kind of pledge. Really easy, and it's nice to toss it out and change your mind later. And that's what most people do. So I'm not going to do it. What I am going to say is that I'm going to hopefully serve in the U.S. House as long as voters have me, and as long as I believe that that's the best contribution I can make to my country and to my state. So I'm just not going to go there, Donna.
Okay, well, I just believe that the state needs to have a permanent legislator and not necessarily a temporary occupant, and I think it's important that we have continuity in our delegation, and that's one of the problems we have now, is that there is no continuity and they're not getting along because everybody's running against everybody. So I just think that that's very important, that we have unity and we have collaboration among our 4 members of Congress. Thank you.
Ms. Fukumoto, your question.
Thank you. This question is for the Lieutenant Governor Chen. I'm sorry. I know we like each other so much, but we need 2 microphones. Thank you. I have short arms. Okay, so Lieutenant Governor Chen, throughout your campaign, you've talked a lot about the different court cases that you've taken, and you have definitely taken a stand for injustice in a lot of places, which I think is really admirable. There's one court case that I'm particularly concerned about. When the Campbell High School students had concerns, and there were kids experiencing dizziness in classrooms, teachers were fainting, they had 100-degree weather, you argued that they had adequate conditions and that the state didn't owe them anything more than that. And I guess I just want to ask you why.
Thank you. By the way, I'm the one in second place, so I don't know why everyone's asking me the questions. But anyway, what I will say is this: the argument that we were making was that the Campbell High School lawsuit had to do with the fact that it was trying to make something, make a result that really is a legislative fix. So in other words, it's not that the courts can be able to rule in that favor and allow for something like that. So certainly, should Campbell High School have better conditions, should have better facilities? Yes, just like every other school that's in the DOE. But the issue that we were raising was that it really needs to be something that is done by the legislature or by the legislators that were bringing that lawsuit, and not something that's done by the courts.
I think the concern that I have with that answer is that when you were fighting the travel ban, it was a discussion about separation of powers, and you felt willing to take that on, which again, I really supported. I think that you should have done that. I think it was the right thing to do, but then you argued against these kids, the same argument, the separation of powers. And so I guess my question is, are you only going to do that when it's on a national stage and people are watching? Why would you not do that for these kids when they needed it, when these kids were falling asleep in class because they couldn't stay awake? It was so hot.
Mr. Chin, you get to ask the final question.
All right. Thank you very much, and I appreciate all the questions. And as you can see, everybody was very sharp. So my question is for you, Mr. Case. It's this. I've been talking about how the U.S. Supreme Court is obviously going to be changing. There's going to be a very different majority if Brett Kavanaugh gets confirmed. And so one of the threats has to do with Roe versus Wade. So one of the things that I was trying to have you explain is really what was your thinking behind the defunding that occurred, that you voted for as the only Democrat that voted to defund family planning centers, including Planned Parenthood. You were the only Democrat to do that. What was your thinking behind that? Do you think that's still wise in light of the fact that we're now in the Trump administration?
Yeah, Doug, you're referring to one vote that I took out of 2,300 votes. And that vote on that particular bill has been dredged up every time I've run for the last decade. In Congress, like in the state legislature, and you haven't served in public office in a legislative session, so you don't know this, but you get Christmas tree bills sometimes. You know they're not going to pass. You're trying to emphasize a particular part of it that you do support, but you've got to vote for some stuff that you don't. In that particular case, one of the 2,300, that bill was never going to pass, but I felt that I needed to support a budgetary principle in that bill. Now, my record on women's issues in this area is 100% by the National Organization of Women, and every other women's issue on votes that counted in this area. So I'm very strong on family planning, Planned Parenthood, Roe v. Wade. I can give you 20 votes in addition to that one that are on the opposite side of what you are trying to say.
Thank you very much for the explanation. I mean, I just think that for all the voters that are out there, it's just so important right now in the time of Trump that whoever is our members of Congress that are representing Hawaii, that they are people that are representing democratic values and are also willing to hold Trump accountable. I'm all for bipartisanship and reaching across the aisle, but I really think that the most important thing that we can do as the people of Hawaii is to make sure that we're holding Trump accountable and also fighting for our values.
Thank you. We'll go back to our panel and moderator questions now. And the first question in this round will be from Ashley.
All right, candidates, after what happened back in January with the false missile alert, do you believe missile alerts should be the responsibility of the federal government? Why or why not? Representative Ng, you're first.
I think we definitely should explore that. I know it's been proposed in the last couple of weeks. What we saw was scary to a lot of people. I think a lot of us thought it was real, and it frightened a lot of folks. It's been such a big issue in this campaign season. I think a little bit too much. We're kind of just all kicking this person in this administration every week, it seems, in the media and on our dinner tables. And really, it's just about checks and balances. Like, if you look at the menu that was like the alert button, it looks like it's from Windows 95. It's really embarrassing. And that's why we need young voices and new leadership in Congress where we can actually have user interfaces that match the 21st century. Because when we have turn of the century, I'm talking about 19th century design, or 18th century, or 20th century design, then that's a deliberate choice to disenfranchise young people.
The false missile alert is something that should have never happened, and I don't necessarily believe that we need to punt this over to the federal government. I believe we need to work with the federal government. I believe that we need to make sure that we have coordination with the federal government, but at the end of the day, it is our responsibility as our state, and part of the problem is the oversight, that we continue to not have that diligent oversight over the responsibilities that we have, and that's part of holding government accountable, and that's something that I have tried to do throughout my career, is holding officials accountable, and to see that they said that they had run 20 tests before this actual one that went through and never found any of these kinds of problems that could exist or could happen really bothers me, because somebody's sleeping at the wheel on that, and we need to do a better job at making sure that we hold all of our officials accountable for their actions and that we have good policies in place.
Thank you, Ashley, for that good question. How are you doing, Ashley? But by all means, the federal government should assume that responsibility. You know what happened that day, right? A mistake was made, but the greater mistake was how long it took to correct that mistake. The military knew right off the bat, once that statement was made, that there was no alert, right? So it shows their capability, to make that type of decision and assessment very quickly. So I would support the federal government assuming that responsibility. But I'm going to use the rest of my time just to make a general comment, because if I don't, I'd be doing a disservice to my parents and where I came from. Doug made a statement that he's in second place. Let me just say this, okay? The way local people are, we never talk bad about anybody. To disrespect one is to disrespect all. There's no candidate in here who's more qualified than the other. It just comes down to a matter of choice. So You know, I would prefer in all these debates, and I've always taken the high road, I've never criticized any of the candidates, only because I respect them for who they are, for what they've done, and that's how it should be. Okay? But I had to say that, otherwise my father would let me lecture me.
Mr. Case.
It was a serious mistake, obviously. It terrified all of us, it terrified our visitors, it created chaos. And I think it was a mistake, obviously, that should never have been made, but it was made. I don't think anybody went out there that day to terrify the entire state of Hawaii, or to wait too long to let everybody know it was okay. So these are mistakes. They're serious mistakes. At some point, you have to work with them and with the situation to try to improve it. I don't think, I think I probably have a difference with Donna on quote unquote holding accountable. Accountable means trying to understand what happened, try to work with people to try to fix the problem, not browbeat them. Because if you browbeat people, then they just never go back to work there. They just leave office. And that's really a serious situation when we do that. As to whether the federal government should do that, maybe. I like Kaneola Ing's answer. I think we've got to take a closer look. It's a simplistic answer to say, yeah, give it to the feds. But you have to kind of standardize it across the board and make sure you have that communication going between the federal and the state government. You can't just wipe the state government out of it. So you got to be a little careful on making those changes, I think.
And there's great ways that the federal government can be able to provide more funding, to be able to provide training and equipment to the counties so that they can be able to handle these emergency operations when they happen. But prior to being the Attorney General, I was the Managing Director for the City and County of Honolulu from 2010 to 2013. And during that time, we handled 2 tsunami warnings and 2 hurricanes, and I was down there at the Emergency Operations Center. So actually, I disagree with everybody on this stage when it comes to the idea that we should take the emergency operation and make it federal for missile alerts. The basis for how we communicate with everybody here in the island, and everybody here in Waikiki knows that, is it comes through the county system. And so for us to be able to handle tsunami alerts, hurricanes, missile attacks, or anything like that, the way that we communicate with everybody is through the county system and with the state's help as well. And so I would support making sure that we help the state and county, but that we don't take it over.
I actually have a similar. I'm not going to disagree with you on the stage. No, I think you're right. I think it is the job of the city and county. I think it's dangerous to take this and make this a decision that Washington makes alone. I think that having some local control is a good idea. But I think that the missile alert crisis did also show the importance of elected officials that are involved in their communities. I had sent out a family plan. I had explained the dangers for all the different emergencies we could face, and I had asked the families in my district to make plans. They were ready on that day. When I walked into my niece's ballet school, because I was in charge of picking her up, I walked in past all these kids who were crying because they got the alerts on their phones and their parents weren't there. And so I sat there and I was able to explain to them that everything was going to be okay and that you just had to stay inside, and they felt more ready because we were there to be able to talk to them more, because their elected leaders were there for them ahead of time and got creative. I think the other thing we saw on that day was that Congresswoman Gabbard was willing to reach out through a different kind of technology to make us feel safer and to get us news before anybody else got it.
Thank you. All right, the next question is about half, hundreds of millions of dollars of our federal rail grant funding is stuck in an ongoing FTA review. Now, flashback last year when the lawmakers had to go into special session to rush to fund a recovery plan that the city told us then was urgent for FTA to release this money. And here we are waiting for that release still. So what would you do in Washington related to release of this frozen rail funding money? The first up is Ms. Kim.
Very much. When I was on the city council, we took that rail vote in the 90s, and I was very disappointed that it didn't pass because we had 90-10 funding at that time, and I remember saying that if we didn't pass it then, we wouldn't be able to afford it in the future, and here we are in the future. I do believe that the fact that we have the rail already up, all of the columns, and continue to build it, that we need to continue it, and we need to get that funding from the federal government. And I intend to work with work with the Department of Transportation and all of the officials, bringing people together, collaborating together, and making sure that we can express why it is we need this, and bring the county with us, and the state, and all of us together need to work in order to make sure that the federal government holds their commitments and release that funds.
Mr. Martin.
You know, I work on this issue almost on a daily basis. Yes, the federal government is withholding a significant amount of money. You know, primarily, it's not really a practical decision on their part, it's more of a political decision. The dynamics in Washington have changed a lot. If this was the same situation under the Obama administration, we would have already gotten those monies released. Because in terms of what we obligated to within the full funding grant agreement has been satisfied. But the FTA continually puts more responsibility on the county to continue to provide them the level of assurances that they feel they need in order to release the money. But the key is to remain consistent, I think, in our message, that we're confident in the project, that we have the necessary leadership in place, that the project will go forward, and that we're committed to completing the line as contemplated. We're fulfilling our end of the bargain, they need to fulfill them. So my position would be to hammer the FTA to assure them that both the county and the state have stepped up to their responsibilities.
Thank you. Mr. Case.
You know, this is a critical issue, and I obviously support the release of the FTA funding in whole as soon as possible. But it also shows a very important couple of lessons as a member of Congress. First of all, when you're from Hawaii, a very small state, we all know we're the best place in the world, the most important place in the world, and we are. But in Washington, D.C., 535 members of Congress, and we have 4. So you better work with the delegation. You better be able to work as a team. Work with the delegation, in coordination with the delegation, and together with the delegation on joint efforts with the FTA in this situation to pry that money loose. Number 2 lesson, always keep the avenues of communication open, regardless of whether the administration is a Republican or a Democratic administration, or whether the majority is a Republican. You can have your partisan fights, and we're going to have them. I'm a proud Democrat, I'll have those partisan fights. But at the end of the day, there's a whole range of issues where you need to be able to walk into the FTA's office, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, or they're run by a Democrat or Republican president, and have a good conversation with them about why the money needs to be released.
Thank you, Mr. Chin.
I really think that brings up the special skill that comes up for people who are members of Congress. In other words, the job of someone who's there isn't just introducing legislation or passing laws, and that can be something that's very effective or not that effective, depending on whether you're the majority or the minority. But a big part of it is really being able to work to get the funding released and to be able to work with all the different agencies. And so I would go back to my experience as the managing director for the city and county. During that time, rail funding was actually an issue even then, and being able to work successfully with the different agencies, being able to work with the congressional delegation at the time, Senator Inouye and Senator Akaka, as well as being able to get the funding that we needed to be appropriated. That was all stuff that we were able to really focus on, and I was able to do successfully. And so I see that that's an important skill that's for whoever ends up in Congress, and I believe that I can be able to accomplish that.
Thank you. I think most of us that have served in elected office know that it is important to be able to make relationships, build them, and get things through those means. For me, I think the larger discussion here, I think Council Chair Martin there actually explains what really is going on with the rail funding. So I appreciate that. I think the larger discussion that we need to have, though, is how do we get more federal funding? That's the question. And what it comes down to is Hawaii's lost 50% of its federal funding because we lost our seniority in the Senate, because we've lost our seniority also in the House. That's one of the reasons why former Congressman Case here made the argument against Senator Akaka. He said that we needed new blood, we needed new people that could build seniority over time. That was his argument then, that's my argument now. We need to make sure that we get somebody in there that can build that seniority and that influence and get us that funding over time. Senator Inouye was 35 when he was elected to Congress. He had plenty of time to build that seniority. That is the only way we get more federal funding.
Well, there are lots of ways to get federal funding. Seniority is definitely one of them. Another is to champion novel ideas, because if a young person gets in, but they're espousing the same tired ideas that haven't worked for generations, nothing's going to change, especially when the same corporate donors are pulling the strings, right? So what we need is candidates who are going to reject all corporate money. Not the only one on this stage, number one. Number two, a candidate that can champion new ideas like a Green New Deal, which would bring our nation to 100% renewable energy by 2035 through a federal job guarantee that would provide advanced energy jobs that's much better than the coal and oil stuff we have out there now. There are lots of jobs and service, and we need to protect those, but they don't pay enough. Most of us are working 2 or 3 jobs just to get by. That's why 70% of my classmates moved to the mainland. If we want to give our children, my 2-year-old son, a shot to stay here, then we need new, bright ideas like a real green infrastructure project. And the more we talk about it, the more public support we build, and that's how we're going to see change happen throughout the nation.
Thank you. Allison, you have the next question.
Okay, I'm going to start with Councilman Martin. Hawaii faces high costs from the number of micronations coming here under the Compact of Free Association. That's only going to get worse as the impacts of global warming expand. What is your take on how Hawaii should handle the issues of growing COFA expenses and migration?
Thank you, Allison, for that question. You know, actually, the most powerful idea came from, which I thought about as well, came from Congresswoman Colleen Hamabusa, who said if she was elected governor, that she would take a position and sue the federal government for some of those obligations that are being placed on the state of Hawaii with respect to an agreement that they executed without the state of Hawaii's consent. You know, I think that's something, suing the federal government, it's an uphill battle, but perhaps some of the discussions that need to be had, and I agree with Ed, I think the delegation itself has to work collectively. You know, if you're gonna take on something of that magnitude, you know, I think it's a discussion worth having, because it does place a significant burden on our state. Those of us who work in government see it firsthand, how much the cost it is for us to comply with the COFA, that is put responsibilities that are placed on the state of Hawaii. So thank you. Thank you for the question.
Mr. Case, you're next.
When I was in Congress the last time, this was a major issue because the compact was coming up for renewal and it had to go through Congress. And the issue at the time was the same issue we have today, which is the impact on the state of Hawaii and other jurisdictions such as Guam, who have a disproportionate number of folks that come from Micronesia. And we succeeded that time around, together with the delegation, so it wasn't we as a delegation, worked very hard to over double the amount of compact impact aid that was paid out especially to the particularly impacted states. Now fast forward here, and the dichotomy or the difference between how much we actually spend as a state in healthcare costs, for example, and how much we get is grown by factors of 3 or 5. And I think that it is a #1 issue for the delegation, and I certainly intend to work on that when I get there with the delegation. I'm not sure about suing the feds, but it's not a bad alternative.
Mr. Chin.
I truly believe that one of the most important things that we can do is to be able to make sure that we're addressing that very important population. When I was the Attorney General, then I was elected by my colleagues to be the chair of the Western states. So that was all 20 states that are west of Texas, basically. Republican and Democratic states, but it also involved the Pacific Islands, the territories, and the other Micronesian attorneys general. They're part of all the community. And one of the things that we were able to talk about at length was, and to be able to educate our colleagues on the Republican side from the mountain states, was just the impact and the importance of the Compact of Free Association, that population, and how important it is that we take care of those individuals. So yes, I would work with the delegation and absolutely support that kind of aid, because that is critical.
Of course, I would repeat what everybody else has said. Of course, I would support continuing aid from the federal government, or asking for more aid from the federal government, but also continuing aid to the COFA nations. Right now, we're looking at cutting foreign aid and getting rid of things like hospitals. there. If they want to stay there, they might not be able to because we're talking about cutting that funding. I would support making sure we're continuing to fund that so this doesn't become an increased problem for Hawaii, and that we actually improve their quality of life there, because that's what the original compact was supposed to be about, reconciling something that we did wrong. And I think we need to continue to do that, but that the federal government does need to chip in, because right now Hawaii is bearing the burden for an agreement that they made.
As a native Hawaiian, I think we know what it's like to be displaced from our homeland. There are more Hawaiians living outside of our state than here today, and we're homeless, in our own islands. So whether it's, people are waking up to understand that whether it's a war on drugs or a war on terror, it's really a war for profit, and it's a war that's causing people all across the world to suffer just like we have. And that's what's happened in Micronesia and the Marshall Islands. And it's our duty to take care of them and make sure that we fix things. So when you get to the root of the problem, why do these interventions keep happening? And why is there so much money and bombs tests? How can we even afford to just test bombs in the middle of the Pacific? It's because Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, these weapon contractors are giving so much money to our Congress people, and it's time we get money out of politics once and for all and end American imperialism.
I believe it was in 1996 when Congress actually passed the legislation to do away with Medicaid benefits for the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. And I think that's a problem. And now Hawaii is costing Hawaii state and counties about $100 million. And so we need to get the federal government, and that's something that I pledged to do in Congress, is to restore this Medicaid benefits to those residents in the islands. They don't want to leave, they don't want to come here and be displaced, but they can, that's the only thing they can do in order to get the benefits. So we need to restore the benefits so that they can, in fact, get that aid that they need. There's also another piece of legislation, the Compact Aid Act of 2015, and this would add $185 million to the budget and allow Hawaii to get the funds that they need to restore in order for us to continue to pay that bill.
Thank you. Our next round of questions, and Allison, you'll actually lead off this one.
Okay, we'll start with Mr. Cave. Global warming and one of its side effects, beach erosion, have become a growing issue statewide and across the nation. Research suggests residents, transportation, infrastructure, schools, hospitals, industry, and commercial areas, among other valuable urban assets, will face billions of dollars in climate-related damages over the coming decades. Do you think government policy should discourage new building in coastal inundation zones, and if so, how? If not, what would you suggest the federal government could do to help reduce the coming harms, which will surely impact Hawaii?
Well, let's start with the big picture long term, as I talked about earlier. First of all, it's scientific reality, so let's get over that part of it. We do have climate change going on, we do have global warming, and we do have a rise in the sea level, and all of us that work here in Waikiki know that in spades, right? I mean, we've had to deal with it in the last couple of years in particular. So let's get beyond the debate over what the facts are. The facts are there. Let's get into how to solve the situation. First of all, I don't believe that there should be a blanket prohibition about building or rebuilding in coastal areas, but certainly you have to take a long-term view in terms of what you need to do to accommodate a 40, 50-year rise in the sea level, as I think Connie already referred to. The federal government can certainly help with coastal engineering, can certainly help with long, big picture studies, and certainly can help with erosion control. I did help along those lines with Waikiki funding for erosion control my last time around. That's a principal focus for the tourism industry in Congress here, right here in Waikiki.
Allison, thanks for asking the question, because obviously it's a key issue here in Waikiki with the funding that's been released for the Army Corps of Engineer program that's going to be able to help out Hawaii Canal, as well as the project that's going to be able to help out the growing area next to Royal Hawaiian. I think this is a critical issue, and really the way federal officials and federal government can really be able to help out. It goes back to what I was talking about, how Part of being a member of Congress is the ability to be able to have the knowledge of what's happening in the city and the state, and to be able to work with the congressional delegation as well as the federal agencies to be able to successfully bring in that funding together. So for example, the way the Alawai Canal funding is being given is it requires support from the state and the counties in order to be able to make that happen. So to bring all that together, that's part of what happens when you're a member of Congress, and I believe I have those skills from being the managing director, from being Attorney General to do that.
Representative Fukumoto.
Thank you. I agree with Congressman Case that we need to get past this discussion over whether or not it's really happening. It's happening. What I would disagree with is that we have 40 or 50 years. In 10 to 20 years, a lot of the new development that we're seeing, the places that we're getting new inventory for housing could be dealing with flooding. So one of the first things that I want to do in Congress is to look at HUD, look at the grants that they give, and require that any grant for housing includes a requirement to build climate resilient development. I'm not saying a blanket prohibition, but I'm saying that if we're going to give you money, you better factor in that climate change is real, that sea level rise is happening, and that we need to make sure that the investments that we're making are going to be there for decades to come, instead of being washed away in the next 10 to 20 years.
It's so Democrats like to say this, right? Science is real, climate change is happening, we cause it, we can reverse it. You'll never see a Democrat in Congress that's going to say otherwise. So we already moved beyond that conversation. Well, the conversation that we need to move beyond that we haven't is cap and trade, carbon taxes, all these incremental changes that won't really fix the problem. We have 15 years to act now unless we'll see climate catastrophe by the year 2100. So we need to champion bold measures like a 100% renewable energy future by 2035. And in order to do that, we need to actually say no to market-based solutions, no to corporate polluters, actually cap their emissions, transition away from fossil fuel cars, no those ridiculous pipelines getting proposed all across America, and really, again, the only way to do that is to reject corporate money, because they're the ones pulling the strings and pushing the incremental half measures in both parties.
You know, I don't think we should be putting politics in science and politics in global warming. As everyone else has said, that we all agree that global warming is real. You know, this past session, we passed legislation on the state level to include evaluations in all of the projects and future projects that we fund, that we put in the impacts of global warming, the impacts of the sea level rise. And I think that's something I agree with Beth, that we need to do on the federal level, that we need to do in Congress, to make sure that we do include what are these impacts and how are they going to impact our lifestyle. You know, there are so many bridges throughout the United States that is going to be underwater if we don't do something in relocating them because of the sea level rise. And so this is very, very serious, and it shouldn't be a political football, which it's turning out to be. Mr. Mercado.
Thank you. You know, I wouldn't refer to it as a political football. I mean, I'm proud to have served on the city and county of Honolulu and served as a chairman of that particular body. I think Honolulu and the state of Hawaii is very progressive on this particular issue. With regards to what has happened on the state, Senator had talked about that. But from the county's perspective, you know, we have a climate change commission. The mayor just went on TV yesterday putting out a directive advising all city agencies to review the report that was issued by the commission and to follow that blueprint. I think, you know, with regards to whoever serves in Congress, at the federal level, you have the blueprint in place already. Now it's a matter of directed resources towards the state to effectuate that blueprint. And you know, Senator Illinois has always been referred to as the king of pork, and I always, working with him very early in my time on the council, I told him that I'm going to follow his footsteps and be the prince of pork, because nobody can ever replace the king.
Ashley, you have the next question.
As our nation's deficits and debt continue to pile up, some members of Congress have been eyeing cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Do you believe it's time for entitlement reform? Lieutenant Governor Chin, you're up.
Well, I think the biggest concern that we have with the Trump administration's tax cuts is that it's potentially a threat to Medicare and Social Security. Security. So I believe that we absolutely must do everything that we can to preserve Social Security and Medicaid, particularly because we have an elderly population. I'll give you another reason for that. We have one of the largest income disparities that's in the country. Hawaii is number 8 out of the 50 states in terms of having a wage gap between people who are the richest and the poorest. And so therefore, having those government entitlement programs are absolutely important. And so yes, I would support those.
Yeah, of course, I would continue to support Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. I take it one step further. I believe in Medicare for all. I think that we have a responsibility to everybody to make sure that they have health care. And I think that all comes down to one thing, that I believe that once we make a commitment to our population, we have to keep it. This state, and one of the reasons why I got involved in politics in the first place, this state tried to change the way we were taxing pensions. Fine, it was for some of the wealthier individuals, but the bottom line is when people are on a fixed income, they're relying on Social Security, they're relying on Medicare, Medicaid. We need to make sure that we're constantly providing them things that they need and not changing up the rules on them because they depend on these things.
You know, when you spend some time in politics, there's only one thing that you really have at the end of the day, and that's your word. I think everybody on this stage will agree with that. And Social Security and Medicare, those are promises to folks that we need to meet. There are no excuses. The problem is with this issue and so many others is Democrats like to come in on a compromised position. Like when we had Merrick Garland as he's like this conservative appointment to SCOTUS, to the Supreme Court, and then we come in and say, here's our compromise candidate that Republicans agree to, and the Republicans come in and say, that's the Democrats' guy, we have this one. In Obamacare, 40 Republican amendments for 0 Republican votes. So we need to be coming in hard and saying we need Medicare for all now. We need to expand Social Security, scrap the cap, so when you're making over $170,000, you have to pay more. Right now, billionaires pay the same into Social Security as janitors and teachers, and it's completely unfair. We need to make the ultra-wealthy pay their fair share.
I agree with Representative Vega, that we need to keep our promises. We made our promises to our seniors, or to the people that when you reach a certain age, that you're going to be able to collect. And you've paid into it. This is not free money. You paid into Social Security. You know, my mom is 88 years old, and she has a very small pension, and without Social Security, she could not survive. And so every day she worries that it's going to get cut. And I know seniors across our state worries. They worry that Medicaid is going to get cut, Medicare, and so these health benefits, and part of that concern and part of that worry is adding to their health and the deterioration of their health. So we need to make it clear to them that we are going to support that, and we're going to look at how can we expand it for those on the very low levels, that really some of the Social Security benefits are really not enough for them to survive on, and they cannot live their years in dignity. And that's something that you have my commitment that I will do in Washington.
Mr. Martin.
Thank you. You know, I think all the candidates are going to argue that they're going to advocate very vigorously on all 3 levels. You know, but I've said this before, I mean, I favor universal health care. But regards to Social Security, no different. But I think, you know, the increases in Social Security have to be tied to the cost of living, some cost of living indexes, because it's almost embarrassing, you know, when you see increases in Social Security pensions, how small it is, and it cannot keep up with the rate of inflation that the country is suffering. That's why it's more and more difficult, especially for our kapuna, to survive on a daily basis. I talked about this at the Hawaii News Now debate. I see it firsthand. You see more and more seniors going to food pantries to get food to survive on a daily basis. Here we are, the most rich and powerful country in the world, and we cannot take care of our own senior citizens. To me, that's personally embarrassing. I take that very personally.
Mr. Case.
Medicare and Social Security are 2 of the most widespread, most influential, most rewarding programs our country has ever adopted. It's hard to imagine a time before Medicare and Social Security, the 20s, the 10s, even before that, the life of the elderly, especially the elderly poor, especially women. This was disproportionately impacting women. So I am absolutely committed to their preservation. They are on a fiscally unsustainable course right now. They are running out of money. It's not going to happen next year, and it's not going to happen in the next decade. But the Medicare track is about a 15-year track now, Social Security is about a 30-year track. That's when we turn the corner, when we don't really have enough money to continue them. Now, would you rather wait 20 years to fix it, or would you rather fix it now? And this is one of the areas that I think we've got to take the hard decisions right now to fix them and preserve them over time. And that doesn't mean entitlement reform, as in the last time I was in Congress meeting, let's gut them. It means fiscally sustainable for generations to come.
Thank you. Our last question will be from the audience. Ms. Fukumoto, you'll be the first to answer, and we'll cycle the same way we've been going. And this question is, the East-West Center seems to have lost its luster, funding, and respect in the greater Pacific community, let alone Washington, D.C. What will you do as a U.S. Congressional representative from Hawaii to raise the importance of the East-West Center in our state, the Pacific region, and our country?
I think there's a broader question here. I of course support the East-West Center, but the broader question is, what is the role of a congressperson? And yes, it's to pass bills, it's to bring home money, but it's also to be an ambassador for our state to other countries, to other states, to other members of other congressional delegations, making sure that they know who we are, they know our values, they know what value we bring to them. And that's something that I think I can do. It's something that I want to be able to do, to be able to show them who we are as a state, why we're valuable, and why something like the East-West Center should be here, and why it's so important for national security and diplomacy.
Mr. Ng.
I'd like to support funding to our university through the federal government, particularly to where we excel, and that's international studies. And the East-West Center has been driving that internationally. I come from the East, and I come from the West. My mom was Japanese, Portuguese, Spanish, and my dad was Hawaiian, Chinese, Dutch, Irish, Jewish, Russian. So, you know, we are a product, my son's Filipino, we are a product of that plantation history. And I think by adopting the best ideas that we see from, like in Singapore, half the size of Oahu, 6 million people roughly, and everyone can afford a brand new 3-bedroom house or flat with just 23% of their income. So the ideas are there, the models are there, but we're just not tapping into the resources that we could, and actually standing up to the oligarchs and corporate donors holding that change in Hawaii. That's something that a lot of the folks I worked with at UH at the East Center have been in the fore of and in the tips of the spears, because we can adopt models from across the world, not just in foreign policy, but in domestic as well.
You know, the East-West Center is so important to our state. It's so important to the world. I had the opportunity of participating at a function where they talked about the number of people that have come through East-West Center and have become leaders throughout the world in different countries. And that's something that we do so well here in Hawaii. I remember talking with Senator Kaka, and he said, you know, Hawaii is like the pico. It's like the beginning where everybody life starts and life spreads out. And I think that's what's so important with the East-West Center. And so in Washington, we need to be able to express that to our colleagues. We need to be able to communicate that. People in Washington think we live in paradise and we don't have any problems. But that's what's so important, having an individual in Washington that can communicate, bring people together, have alliances, and so that they know and understand what's important to our way of life and our culture here in Hawaii. And that's something that I have done and I will continue to do.
Mr. Martin.
You know, I'm proud to have had the opportunity to stand shoulder to shoulder with many East-West fellows in my time at the executive branch and now at the Honolulu City Council. You know, I think it's not just a matter of us at the congressional level assisting with bringing the East-West Center back to the forefront, but all of us who serve politically, whether it's at the county, state, and federal level, to make it known how important the East-West Center is, not just to the state of Hawaii or the university, but internationally. The opportunities it present, the privileges for those who are fortunate to attend, and then those who will benefit as a result of the work of the East-West Center. But, you know, most definitely, I mean, all of us would admit Senator Inouye made the East-West Center a highlight of his own administration as a U.S. Senator, and no one has stepped up and picked up on that legacy. But no one, not one of us can ever replace Senator, no one. So collectively, I think we all can do a good job.
Mr. Case.
Very strong supporter of the East-West Center. When I was in Congress, I definitely participated with the delegation led by Senator Inoue. Ernie is correct, to guarantee funding of the East-West Center from year to year. But you know, appropriation bills have to start in the House, so you can't just depend on Senator Inoue. You got to start them off in the House. One of the important things that we did was to expose as many members of Congress to the East-West Center as we could, because that you have to show off your state. You have to say, hey, this is what's happening in my state. This is what you should come out here and experience. This is what I want your help with and why we did that. The East-West Center, I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question. I don't think it has lost its luster overseas. I think you go out there overseas and people know it perfectly well still and respect it. Possibly the East-West Center has not done a good enough job inside of Hawaii to maintain a connection between itself and the community. So if you are from the East-West Center and you ask that question, that would be my advice on that. But strong support, continued funding, continued support for the East-West Center in Congress.
Mr. Chin.
A couple weeks ago, in my office of Lieutenant Governors, there were a dozen reporters that showed up that were from all around the world. And they were from BBC, NPR, there was someone who was locally represented here, but they were also from New Zealand, China, Vietnam, Japan, and part of it was that they were going around, starting in Hawaii, to different Asian countries to talk about the subject of democracy and populism during this current generation. And it was such an interesting topic, and everybody had so many things to share as we talked for a couple hours. They were there talking to me about the travel ban lawsuit and what was happening with the U.S. Supreme Court and some of the things that I saw there. The program was sponsored by the East-West Center, and it was brought all the way over to Singapore, and several people were there that was able to, from the East-West Center, they were able to close it out. So yes, I would support